long before the first pyramid caught sunlight on its limestone skin, before any king etched his name into stone, there was a story whispered into wet clay that should not exist at all. It spoke of a world that had not yet learned how to be solid, of time before time behaved as time, of memory older than cities and older than gods as we usually imagine them. According to those fragments, existence did not begin with thunder or command, but with an endless, silent deep where nothing had shape, and yet everything waited. Why would the earliest writers of humanity describe creation not as an act, but as a slow awakening? Why would they place water, not fire or light, at the very root of reality? Why do these accounts insist that heaven and earth were once locked together like a single body, unable to breathe, unable to allow life to exist between them? Why do later stories about powerful sky beings arriving fully formed feel so different from these older, quieter memories? Why does the timeline fracture when examined closely, revealing layers beneath layers, as if history itself had been rewritten on top of something far older? If these ancient scribes were not inventing fantasy and not recording science, then what exactly were they trying to remember? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. There was a time imagined so distant that even the idea of distance had not yet learned how to stretch itself. The ancient Sumerian mind reached backward into that darkness and did not find gods walking on solid ground or stars burning in ordered paths. Instead, it found water, endless, unmoving, without shore or current. This was not water as rain or river, not something you could drink or drown in, but water as a condition of being, like a boundless black ocean seen in a dream where depth cannot be measured and surface does not exist. The scribes called it Nammu, a name that meant more than a deity and less than a person, closer to the idea of origin itself than to any figure with a face. In the flat floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, water decided everything. It arrived too early and crops rotted. It arrived too late and fields cracked into dust. It came gently and life expanded. It came violently and entire cities vanished beneath brown waves. For people who lived with that reality, imagining existence beginning in water was not poetic exaggeration. It was logic born from survival. When they looked at the land beneath their feet, they knew that if you dug deep enough, water always answered. When springs erupted from stone and rivers renewed themselves each year as if reborn, the conclusion felt unavoidable. Beneath all things, water waited. Nammu existed before sky and earth learned their names. She did not rule, command, or conquer. She simply was. The texts do not describe her speaking, judging, or moving with intention the way later gods would. Instead, she functioned like a vast reservoir of possibility, a silent pressure holding everything that might someday exist. In modern terms, she resembles an idea more than a character, closer to what physics would later call potential energy, though imagined through myth rather than measurement. Nothing had yet separated. Nothing had yet taken sides. From this undivided state, two forces emerged, not born through conflict or desire, but through differentiation, like shapes appearing in fog. An became the sky, imagined as a massive dome arcing overhead, solid enough to hold back waters above it. Kai became the earth, the heavy, fertile ground that would one day accept seeds, cities, and bones. At first, they were not truly separate. Heaven and earth clung together, pressed so tightly that no space remained between them. There was no air, no wind, no place for breath. Potential existed, but nowhere for life to stand. The separation came through violence, not in the sense of malice, but necessity. Enlil, whose name carried the sense of air, wind, and breath, forced An upward and Kai downward. The motion tore existence open. In that rupture, space was born. Air rushed into the gap like a first inhalation. The world could finally breathe. Creation, in this telling, did not unfold smoothly or gently. It began with strain, with resistance, with the pain of division. Order required breaking unity apart. This detail matters because it reveals how the Sumerians understood reality itself. Life did not emerge from harmony alone, but from tension. Without separation, nothing could grow. Without conflict, nothing could move. The sky rose beyond reach, the earth settled into solidity, and between them stretched the invisible realm of air, the domain of storms and seasons, of voices carried and seeds scattered. This middle space became the stage for everything human. Before this separation, the texts hint at a strange condition where time itself behaved differently. They struggle to describe it, using phrases that feel almost apologetic, as if language itself were insufficient. There was no calendar, no cycle of day and night, no aging. Existence lingered in suspension, neither progressing nor ending. Only after the sky was lifted did time begin to flow in a way recognizable to human experience. Later traditions would split the primordial waters into fresh and salt, naming them and giving them personalities, but the older Sumerian memory insisted on unity. Nammu preceded division. She was before sweet springs and bitter seas, before rivers learned direction and oceans learned boundary. This older vision suggests a world view where complexity emerges gradually, not all at once, and where the earliest layer of reality is simple, vast, and silent. Archaeology supports how deeply these ideas were tied to place. The city of Eridu, now surrounded by dry land but once close to the Persian Gulf, sat where water and earth constantly negotiated their boundary. To the Sumerians, it was not merely old, it was first. They believed civilization itself surfaced there, rising from the edge of the cosmic deep. The temple of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, was built over what they believed to be the point where the subterranean waters touched the human world. Rituals performed there were not symbolic gestures. They were acts conducted at what the priests believed was the literal seam of creation. Enki himself belonged to a later generation than Nammu, but his domain linked directly back to her. He ruled the Abzu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, imagined as a hidden ocean feeding wells, springs, and rivers. When farmers lowered buckets into deep shafts and drew up water, they were not just accessing a resource. They were touching the remnants of the original state of existence. Every drink carried memory. This cosmology did not see the world as static. It required maintenance. Floods, droughts, storms, and fertility were not automatic processes. They were signs that balance held or failed. The gods were not distant engineers who built the universe and walked away. They were managers constantly adjusting a fragile system. Order could slip. Chaos always waited beneath, patient as water. What becomes clear when reading these texts carefully is that the Anunnaki, so often portrayed in modern retellings as prime movers or alien architects, arrive late in the story. They are not creators of heaven or earth. They do not emerge from the primordial waters. They are descendants, inheritors of a structure already built. By the time their names appear, the universe already has depth, hierarchy, and memory. This matters because it reshapes how the entire mythological timeline is understood. The earliest layers are not about advanced beings arriving from elsewhere, but about humans struggling to explain why existence feels precarious, why floods erase generations, why life depends on forces no one can control. The gods reflect those anxieties. They are born from them. In this worldview, creation is not a single moment locked in the past. It is an ongoing condition. Every storm threatens to undo what was separated. Every drought reminds humans that beneath solid ground waits water, and beneath order waits chaos. The story does not begin with dominion, but with vulnerability. And that vulnerability, carried forward through generations, shaped how the Sumerians understood themselves, not as masters of the world, but as temporary occupants standing between sky and abyss, breathing borrowed air. Once the sky had been lifted and the earth pressed downward into firmness, the universe did not suddenly become familiar. It remained strange, unfinished, and unstable, like a house with walls but no rooms. The space between heaven and earth allowed movement, but movement alone did not create meaning. The Sumerian texts describe this phase as a world that existed but did not yet know how to function. Light had a source, but cycles were not yet fixed. Water flowed, but its paths were uncertain. Sound existed, but nothing yet listened. The first generations of gods emerged into this incomplete structure as embodiments of forces rather than personalities. They were not distant rulers issuing decrees from beyond the stars. They were closer to living principles, each bound to a specific behavior of the world. The moon became Nana, whose slow, predictable swelling and fading gave humans their earliest sense of time, passing in measurable units. Each month was no longer an abstraction, but a visible rhythm written across the night sky. The sun became Utu, whose daily journey exposed everything equally, earning him association with justice, not because he judged, but because nothing could hide from his light. These gods did not create order from nothing. They stabilized what already existed. By repeating their motions reliably, they taught the world how to behave. Seasons learned when to arrive. Days learned how long to last. Humans, watching from below, learned to anticipate instead of merely react. Civilization begins not when cities are built, but when uncertainty is reduced enough to allow planning. Enki's role during this phase became increasingly central. While Enlil ruled the air with storms and authority, Enki governed the quieter but more persistent force beneath everything. His domain, the Abzu, was imagined as an immense freshwater reservoir hidden under the Earth's crust. This idea was not abstract theology. In the Mesopotamian plain, water lay close to the surface. Digging almost anywhere produced moisture. Wells seemed to tap into something vast and continuous, not isolated pockets. To the Sumerians, it felt logical that all water was connected, part of a single subterranean body older than land itself. Enki was associated with wisdom not because he was omniscient, but because he understood systems. He knew how one change rippled into another. He knew that stopping a flood upstream could starve fields downstream, that excessive order could be as dangerous as chaos. His solutions were rarely forceful. They were clever, indirect, sometimes even deceptive. This made him an uneasy figure among the gods, respected but not always trusted. During this era, the gods themselves labored. The texts describe junior deities digging canals, piling silt, and shaping the land to make it usable. This divine labor reflects a worldview where even gods were subject to necessity. Order required effort. Maintenance required exhaustion. The cosmos was not self-sustaining. It demanded work. The complaints of these laboring gods form one of the most revealing moments in the Sumerian record. They grow tired. They protest. They weep. Their suffering reaches Nammu, the primordial source, who no longer shapes reality directly, but still responds when imbalance threatens. She approaches Enki not as a subordinate, but as a reminder of origin, urging him to address a problem that could unravel creation itself. The solution Enki proposes changes everything. Instead of forcing gods to continue endless labor, he suggests creating a new being to carry that burden. Humans are not created as an experiment in intelligence or creativity. They are created as a response to exhaustion. This is not a flattering origin story, but it is an honest one. Humanity enters the cosmos as a functional necessity. The material chosen for human creation matters deeply. Clay taken from the Abzu, mixed with divine essence, becomes flesh. Clay was the substance of daily life in Mesopotamia. Houses were built from it. Tablets were written on it. When floods came, cities dissolved back into it. Making humans from clay meant making them temporary by design, capable of shape, but destined to erode. The involvement of birth goddesses in this process reinforces the idea that creation was messy, physical, and uncertain. The texts describe trial and error. Some humans are formed imperfectly. Some cannot see, some cannot walk, some cannot function as intended. Rather than discarding them, Enki assigns them roles. This moment reveals a worldview that acknowledges limitation as part of design. Not every being exists for the same purpose, and value is not measured solely by productivity. Before agriculture, before animals were domesticated, humans lived in a state barely distinguishable from wildlife. The texts describe them eating grass, drinking from ditches, lacking clothing, lacking tools. This is not presented as a moral failure, but as an incomplete stage. Consciousness existed, but knowledge had not yet been delivered. The arrival of grain and sheep transforms everything. These are not merely food sources, they are technologies, imagined as divine beings because of how radically they alter existence. Grain allows storage, which allows planning, which allows hierarchy. Sheep provide wool, enabling clothing, which enables protection, which enables expansion into harsher environments. With these gifts, humans cross a threshold. Survival becomes culture. Cities emerge as a result, not a cause. Once surplus exists, specialization follows. Scribes record, builders construct, priests mediate between human and divine. Kingship appears not as a human invention, but as a divine installation, a mechanism to concentrate responsibility. According to the Sumerian king list, rulership descends from heaven fully formed, not gradually evolved. The earliest kings rule for spans that defy comprehension. Tens of thousands of years stretch across names that feel more symbolic than historical. These figures belong to a different kind of time, one where the boundary between divine and human is still thin. They are not remembered for deeds, but for duration, marking an age when existence itself moved slowly. This period ends in catastrophe. Noise fills the world as cities grow. Human activity becomes constant, restless, overwhelming. The gods, particularly Enlil, experience this not as progress but as disturbance. The same civilization that relieved them of labor now robs them of rest. Balance tips again. What follows is not punishment for sin, but a reset born of irritation. The flood that approaches is not moral judgment. It is environmental collapse elevated to cosmic scale. Water, the original substance of existence, rises again to reclaim form. Enki, consistent with his nature, finds a way around total annihilation. He preserves not humanity's innocence, but its continuity. A single family, a single vessel, carries memory through destruction. When the waters recede, the world doesn't begin anew. It resumes. This rhythm, creation, imbalance, correction, defines the Sumerian understanding of reality. The Anunnaki, when they finally appear clearly, enter a world already shaped by these cycles. They are not originators. They are administrators of fate within a system far older than themselves. To understand what came before them is to understand that the deepest Sumerian memories are not about visitors from the sky, but about the fragile space between water and air, where human life learned, briefly, how to last. When humans first appeared in the ordered world shaped by sky, earth, and breath, they did not step into a finished landscape. The fields were not yet tamed, the rivers not yet disciplined by canals, and the cities that would one day dominate the plains did not yet exist, even as ideas. Humanity emerged into a world that required constant negotiation with forces far older and stronger than itself. Survival depended not on mastery, but on alignment. The Sumerian texts describe early humans as beings suspended between two inheritances. From the gods, they carried a spark of intention, an ability to plan, remember, and imagine beyond the immediate moment. From the clay, they inherited fragility, a body that could be broken by flood, disease, or hunger. This tension defined their existence. They were capable of building, but never immune to collapse. As populations grew and knowledge accumulated, humans began to organize space. Fields were marked, canals dug, and temples raised from mud brick, each one oriented carefully toward the heavens. These structures were not merely functional, they were anchors, points where the human world attempted to fix itself within the larger cosmic order. A temple was not a place where gods lived permanently. It was a place where the boundary between realms thinned, where offerings could pass upward and protection could pass downward. Cities formed around these sacred centers, and with cities came hierarchy. The Sumerians did not view hierarchy as oppression by default. It was understood as a reflection of cosmic structure. Just as heaven stood above earth, and earth above the waters below, kings stood above citizens, priests above laypeople, elders above children. Order was vertical by nature. The Sumerian king list records this worldview with unsettling clarity. Kingship, it states, descended from heaven. This was not metaphor in the modern sense. It was a literal claim that authority did not originate in human agreement, but in divine assignment. The earliest kings ruled not because they seized power, but because power was placed upon them. Their role was not to innovate, but to maintain balance. The reigns attributed to these early rulers stretch across spans so vast that they resist historical reading. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. His successors ruled for tens of thousands more. These numbers do not function as chronology in the way modern historians use dates. They function as signals. They mark a period where time itself moved differently, where the distance between gods and humans had not yet hardened into separation. These antediluvian kings ruled 5 cities, each representing a different aspect of early civilization. Eridu stood at the edge of the cosmic waters, embodying origin and wisdom. Bad Tibira was associated with metalwork, the transformation of raw material into tools that extended human reach. Lairak carried associations with healing and purification, suggesting concern for the body as well as the land. Sipar, sacred to the sun, became a center of justice and learning, where light and law were intertwined. Shuruppak, the final city, held the burden of ending, the last place to exist before the world was undone. These cities were not merely locations. They were stages in a progression, moving from creation to complexity, from potential to excess. As each city rose, human activity intensified. Fields expanded, trade networks grew, noise filled the plains. The texts emphasize this noise repeatedly, not as background detail but as a critical factor. Sound becomes a symbol for uncontrolled vitality, for life overflowing its boundaries. To the gods, particularly Enlil, this noise was not evidence of success. It was a threat. The ordered world depended on restraint as much as growth. Too much activity disrupted the delicate equilibrium established at creation. Humans, by thriving, destabilized the system that allowed them to exist. The decision to send the flood emerges from this logic. It is not framed as vengeance or moral correction. There is no list of sins. There is no accusation of corruption. The problem is scale. Humanity has become too numerous, too active, too present. The gods cannot rest. The cosmos vibrates with human movement. The flood returns the world to its earliest condition. Water, the first substance, reasserts dominance. Cities dissolve back into mud. Canals overflow and vanish. The separation between heaven and earth remains, but the surface world loses definition. In this sense, the flood is not destruction, but regression, a temporary collapse into an earlier state. Enki's intervention preserves continuity without preventing consequence. By warning Ziusudra, he ensures that knowledge survives even as structures fail. The boat becomes a mobile boundary, a contained fragment of order floating within chaos. Inside it, humans and animals coexist in enforced stillness, waiting for conditions to stabilize. When the waters recede, the world that emerges is not identical to the one that was lost. Something has shifted. The distance between gods and humans increases. Lifespans shorten. Kings no longer rule for tens of thousands of years. Time accelerates. History, as opposed to mythic duration, begins. The Anunnaki become more visible in this post-flood world. They are described not as creators or destroyers, but as judges. Their role centers on fate, death, and the underworld. They determine outcomes rather than initiate change. This positioning matters. It places them within a system already constrained by rules, already shaped by prior events. In stories like the descent of Inanna into the underworld, the Anunnaki appear as impersonal authorities. They do not argue or persuade. They enforce. When Inanna stands before them stripped of her powers, they do not weigh her intentions. They apply consequence. Even a goddess must submit to the structure they uphold. This portrayal contrasts sharply with later interpretations that imagine the Anunnaki as technologically advanced overseers manipulating humanity from above. The original texts offer no such image. They present beings bound to specific functions, operating within inherited constraints. They are powerful, but not free. Understanding this shift clarifies the deeper Sumerian message. Creation does not move toward perfection. It moves toward limitation. The early world allows proximity between divine and human. The later world enforces distance. Memory becomes more important as direct experience fades. Writing itself emerges as a response to this loss. Clay tablets preserve what can no longer be accessed directly. Myths become archives of conditions that no longer exist. The Sumerians do not record their past to glorify it, but to explain why the present feels narrower, harsher, and more fragile. Part 3 closes a long arc that began in water and passes through separation, labor, abundance, excess, and collapse. By the time the Anunnaki assume their familiar roles, the foundations of existence are already set. They do not arrive to build the world. They inherit it, enforce its rules, and remind both gods and humans that once boundaries are drawn, crossing them carries consequences. This understanding strips the story of spectacle, but gives it weight. The Sumerian cosmos is not a stage for alien intervention or hidden technology. It is a fragile system built on compromise, memory, and constant threat of return to chaos. And humanity, born from clay and divine essence, stands always at the center of that tension. Neither ruler nor victim, but participant in a world that remembers its beginnings too well. After the floodwaters withdrew and the land slowly revealed itself again, the world did not feel renewed so much as restrained. The Sumerian texts imply a subtle but decisive change, as if something essential had been sealed off. The earth could once again support fields and cities, but the easy proximity between gods and humans had narrowed. The world still functioned, yet it now did so under firmer limits. What had once felt fluid became regulated. What had once been expansive became measured. This new condition is reflected most clearly in the shortening of human life. The immense lifespans attributed to the antediluvian kings vanish abruptly. Post-flood rulers reign for decades instead of millennia. This is not presented as punishment, but as consequence. Time itself tightens. Days and years gain weight. Mortality becomes unavoidable rather than theoretical. The human body, already made of clay, now feels its composition more acutely. Kingship continues, but its character shifts. The king is no longer a being hovering between divine and human. He is unmistakably mortal. His authority remains sacred yet fragile. Illness, rebellion, and failure are no longer anomalies. They are expected risks. The king becomes less a godlike steward of cosmic order and more a caretaker struggling to keep balance within an unforgiving world. The gods, too, recede. They remain active, but less visible. Instead of shaping reality directly, they operate through signs, omens, and decrees. Communication becomes formalized. Dreams replace conversations. Ritual replaces presence. The divine world does not disappear, but it becomes layered behind symbols and intermediaries. This shift is mirrored in the growing importance of priesthood. Priests are no longer simply attendants to gods who might appear at any moment. They become specialists in interpretation. They read the will of the gods in liver patterns, star movements, and the behavior of smoke rising from sacrifice. Knowledge becomes technical. Access to meaning requires training. Writing expands alongside this need. What began as a practical system for accounting grain and labor becomes a tool for preserving memory and divine instruction. Clay tablets accumulate not just transactions, but hymns, laws, myths, and incantations. Each tablet is a defense against forgetting. Each mark pressed into clay asserts that meaning can survive separation. The Anunnaki occupy a clear position within this reorganized cosmos. They are invoked in contexts of judgment and fate, not creation. Their authority is final rather than generative. They do not invent laws, they enforce outcomes. When destinies are fixed, it is they who ratify the decision. Their power lies not in motion, but in closure. This role places them in the underworld, a realm that gains sharper definition after the flood. The underworld is not hell in a moral sense. It is a destination shared by all mortals regardless of virtue. It is dry, dusty, and dim, a place where existence continues in a reduced form. The Anunnaki preside there as administrators of inevitability. No argument alters their verdict. No plea delays their decree. The underworld's prominence reflects a growing Sumerian preoccupation with endings. As lifespans shorten and cities rise and fall within observable memory, death becomes central rather than distant. Rituals for the dead multiply. Offerings are made not to ensure reward, but to prevent neglect. Being forgotten is feared more than being punished. The living respond by anchoring themselves more firmly in order. Laws are codified, boundaries are marked, calendars are standardized. The predictable cycles of moon and sun are tracked with increasing precision. Time becomes a tool rather than a mystery. This does not eliminate anxiety, but it channels it into structure. The gods support this development. Enki continues to offer guidance through clever interventions, often subtle enough to be missed by those not paying attention. Utu reinforces justice by illuminating actions rather than judging them. Inanna embodies contradiction more fully than ever, representing both fertility and war, attraction and violence. Her complexity mirrors the human condition in a world no longer buffered by divine proximity. Stories about the gods grow darker during this era. Conflicts intensify, rivalries harden, consequences become permanent. The playful experimentation seen in early creation myths gives way to cautionary narratives. Mistakes now carry weight. Crossing boundaries invites retaliation. Knowledge becomes powerful and dangerous. Human beings, aware of their vulnerability, seek stability through repetition. Festivals reenact cosmic events. Myths are recited to keep memory alive. Each retelling reinforces the idea that the world's structure is not guaranteed. It must be remembered to persist. In this environment, the Anunnaki function as reminders rather than actors. They represent the fixed endpoints that no amount of ingenuity can evade. Their presence ensures that fate remains impersonal. Even gods submit to it. When Inanna is judged in the underworld, her power does not exempt her. This reinforces a sobering lesson. Status does not dissolve consequence. Modern interpretations that cast the Anunnaki as architects of humanity overlook this essential context. The Sumerian texts do not portray them as innovators or benefactors. They are not teachers or engineers. They appear after the world's foundations are laid, after humanity is already struggling to maintain balance. Their authority emerges precisely when flexibility diminishes. The post-flood world is not inferior to what came before, but it is narrower. It allows for achievement, but not transcendence. Cities can flourish, but they can also fail. Knowledge can accumulate, but it cannot erase mortality. The cosmos has settled into a pattern that resists change. This is the world the Sumerians recognized as their own, a world where the past was richer, closer, and more fluid, but also more dangerous. A world where the present required discipline, humility, and constant negotiation with forces that no longer spoke directly. By Part 4, the narrative has fully transitioned from cosmic emergence to historical consciousness. The emphasis shifts from how the world began to how it must be managed. The gods remain, but they are increasingly mediated. Humanity stands alone more often, guided by memory rather than presence. What persists through all these changes is the underlying structure established at the beginning. Water beneath, earth in the middle, sky above. That architecture never collapses again. It endures floods, kings, wars, and forgetting. And within it, humans continue their brief lives, shaped by forces older than their cities and governed by destinies fixed long before their names are written into clay. As generations passed in the tightened world that followed the flood, memory itself became a form of survival. The Sumerians did not treat the past as something finished and unreachable. They believed it lingered beneath the present, layered like sediment left by retreating waters. Each ritual, each recited myth, each tablet pressed into clay was an attempt to keep those layers aligned, preventing the present from collapsing into chaos. The growing complexity of society demanded systems that could outlast individual lives. Oral tradition alone was no longer sufficient. Writing transformed from a practical accounting tool into a vessel for permanence. Names, once carried only in voices, were fixed into wedges and lines. A king's reign could be remembered beyond his bones. A prayer could survive the death of the priest who spoke it. Writing did not merely record reality, it stabilized it. With this stabilization came an increasing awareness of fate. The Sumerians believed that events were not random, but neither were they entirely predictable. Fate existed as a pattern rather than a script. The gods did not plan every moment, but they established boundaries within which outcomes unfolded. Within those boundaries, choice mattered, but only to a point. The Anunnaki embodied this principle. Their judgments did not create circumstances, they finalized them. When a destiny was sealed, it passed beyond alteration. This made them both feared and respected. Unlike gods associated with fertility or weather, whose moods could shift and whose favor could be courted, the Anunnaki were implacable. Once fate reached them, it stopped moving. This worldview shaped how humans understood misfortune. Disease, crop failure, and death were not necessarily punishments. They were expressions of an underlying order that humans could influence, but never fully control. Appeasing the gods mattered, but it did not guarantee immunity. Ritual reduced risk. It did not eliminate it. The underworld grew more prominent in cultural imagination during this period. It was no longer a vague destination, but a structured realm with gates, rules, and officials. Entry into it was inevitable. Preparation mattered more than escape. Offerings to deceased ancestors ensured continued connection. Forgetting the dead risked severing ties that still held meaning. This emphasis on continuity extended to kingship. Kings were expected to maintain justice not because it pleased the gods emotionally, but because imbalance threatened the entire system. A corrupt ruler did not merely harm his subjects, he weakened the fabric of reality. The king's failures echoed upward and downward, disturbing gods and underworld alike. Legal codes emerge from this logic. Law was not a human invention imposed on chaos. It was a reflection of cosmic order translated into social terms. To steal, to lie, to exploit was not simply immoral. It was destabilizing. Justice restored balance. Punishment reasserted structure. The sun god Utu's association with law reinforced this idea. His light revealed actions as they truly were. Darkness allowed disorder to hide. Courts were not places of innovation, but of exposure. Truth was assumed to exist already. It simply needed to be uncovered. Inanna's role evolves as well. Her contradictions intensify. She grants fertility but also incites war. She blesses love but also demands sacrifice. This duality mirrors the post-flood world's tension. Growth and destruction coexist. Expansion invites conflict. Civilization creates both abundance and vulnerability. The gods' relationships with one another become more formal. Divine assemblies convene to decide matters of consequence. Decrees are issued rather than impulses followed. The cosmos begins to resemble a bureaucracy, reflecting the human societies developing below. This mirroring reinforces the idea that order is universal, operating across all levels of existence. Within this framework, humanity's origin as a labor force takes on deeper significance. Humans are not merely workers, they are caretakers. Their labor maintains temples, fields, and rituals that sustain the gods. In return, the gods maintain the conditions that allow life to continue. It is an exchange, unequal but reciprocal. The Anunnaki's detachment from daily life emphasizes this arrangement. They do not intervene in farming or weather. They intervene at thresholds: birth, death, judgment. Their presence marks transitions rather than processes. They are encountered when something ends or becomes irreversible. This helps explain why later interpretations that cast them as constant overseers or engineers feel incompatible with the original texts. The Sumerian Anunnaki are not omnipresent manipulators. They are boundary keepers. Their authority lies in limits, not innovation. As centuries pass, this understanding becomes embedded in cultural reflexes. People act with an awareness that not everything can be fixed. Appeals are made, but acceptance follows. The universe is not hostile, but it is indifferent to individual desire. Survival depends on cooperation with structure rather than defiance of it. Even creativity follows this pattern. Music, poetry, and art flourish, but within established forms. Innovation occurs through variation, not rupture. The fear of provoking imbalance tempers ambition. Stability is valued over disruption. This does not mean the Sumerians lacked imagination or courage. It means their imagination operated within a worldview that recognized fragility as fundamental. They lived on land that could vanish beneath floodwater. They built cities from materials that dissolved in rain. Permanence was always provisional. Writing, ritual, and law were responses to this reality. They were attempts to hold shape against erosion. The Anunnaki, as figures of finality, reminded everyone that even these defenses had limits. By Part 5, the narrative has fully settled into a mature cosmology. The world exists. Humanity functions. The gods maintain distance. Fate governs outcomes. Memory preserves what presence no longer provides. What began in water has become structure. What began in proximity has become mediation. And within that mediated world, humans continue to act, build, and remember, fully aware that beneath their feet the primordial waters still wait, patient and unchanged, ready to reclaim form the moment balance fails. As the Sumerian world matured under the weight of memory and limitation, attention turned increasingly toward interpretation. Events no longer spoke for themselves. Every flood, every illness, every unexpected success demanded meaning. The universe, as it was now understood, did not communicate directly. It signaled. Humans learned to read those signals or suffer the consequences of misunderstanding them. This need gave rise to divination as a formal discipline. Divination was not superstition in the casual sense. It was a system for decoding patterns believed to reflect divine intention. The gods, having withdrawn from constant presence, left traces in the arrangement of organs, the movement of stars, the behavior of animals, and the timing of dreams. To ignore these traces was to move blindly within a structured world. Liver divination became especially prominent. The liver, believed to be the seat of life and decision, was examined after sacrifice for markings, textures, and irregularities. These features were not random. They were read as messages, each corresponding to specific outcomes. Extensive manuals were compiled, cataloging thousands of possible signs. This was not guesswork. It was accumulated observation turned into reference. Astrology developed alongside this practice. The sky, once simply the realm of An, became a vast text written in light. Movements of planets and stars were tracked with precision. Their positions at the time of a king's birth, a treaty's signing, or a city's founding were recorded and compared against outcomes. Over time, correlations emerged, patterns were identified, meaning was extracted. This did not imply that fate was fully predictable. Divination revealed tendencies, not certainties. It indicated pressure points, moments of vulnerability, windows of opportunity. Human action still mattered, but it mattered within constraints. To act against an omen was not forbidden, but it was risky. Ignorance increased danger. The Anunnaki appear frequently in texts associated with these practices. They are invoked when outcomes must be fixed rather than interpreted. Their involvement marks the transition from possibility to conclusion. Once a decision reaches them, interpretation ends. Fate crystallizes. This understanding influenced how humans approached decision-making. Major actions were delayed until favorable signs appeared. Wars were postponed. Buildings were redesigned. Kings altered plans based on readings. Authority did not reside solely in power, but in alignment with perceived cosmic conditions. The priesthood's influence expanded accordingly. Priests were no longer simply ritual performers. They were analysts, trained to recognize significance within complexity. Their authority derived from specialized knowledge rather than lineage alone. This created a parallel power structure that balanced royal authority. Kings relied on priests, but they also feared them. A negative omen could undermine a ruler's legitimacy. A bad interpretation could incite unrest. Managing information became as important as managing resources. Control of meaning was control of stability. The gods themselves are portrayed as respecting these systems. They do not contradict established signs casually. Even divine action appears to follow protocol. This reinforces the impression that the cosmos operates according to rules, not whims. Order governs even those who embody it. Within this context, myths serve as explanatory models. They illustrate how the system functions under stress. When a god violates boundaries, consequences follow. When balance is restored, stability returns. These stories are not entertainment. They are instructional narratives encoding expectations. The story of Inanna's descent, for example, is less about adventure than about inevitability. Each gate strips her of power. Each removal is irreversible. When she reaches the Anunnaki, her fate is sealed. Rescue requires negotiation, substitution, and sacrifice. Nothing is free. Nothing is undone without cost. This logic permeates human experience. Loss demands compensation. Gain demands restraint. The universe maintains equilibrium through exchange. Excess in one area creates deficit in another. Awareness of this principle shapes behavior. The underworld's role as a final ledger reinforces this mindset. The dead do not escape consequence, but neither are they rewarded for virtue. They persist in a diminished state, sustained by remembrance. Offerings matter not because they change fate, but because they maintain connection. This makes forgetting a serious offense. To erase a name is to sever existence. Writing again becomes crucial. Inscriptions on tombs, statues, and tablets ensure continuity. Memory defies death by refusing erasure. The Anunnaki preside over this ultimate accounting. They do not evaluate intention, they confirm outcome. Their authority underscores a sobering truth. Existence does not bend to desire. It responds to structure. In contrast to later interpretations that imagine the universe as designed for human progress, the Sumerian worldview is fundamentally cautious. Advancement is possible, but regression is always nearby. Growth requires vigilance. Stability requires effort. The environment reinforces this caution. The rivers that nourish can also destroy. The same waters that sustain fields can erase cities overnight. Living within such a landscape conditions thought toward humility. Human achievements are impressive, but temporary. The gods mirror this environment. They are powerful, but constrained. They act, but within limits. Even Enki, the most flexible among them, operates through loopholes rather than rebellion. Cleverness replaces force. Survival replaces domination. By Part 6, the Sumerian cosmos appears fully operational as a system of signs, rules, and consequences. The creative chaos of beginnings has settled into patterned complexity. Humanity navigates this system not as a chosen species, but as a necessary one, embedded within a larger mechanism. The Anunnaki stand at the system's edges, ensuring closure where openness once existed. They do not create meaning, but they enforce its final form. Their presence reminds all beings, mortal and divine, that once a threshold is crossed, return is no longer guaranteed. This realization does not produce despair. It produces discipline. Life is lived carefully, attentively, aware that every action echoes. The universe listens, but it answers in its own time and language. And those who fail to learn that language risk becoming another layer of sediment beneath the ever-waiting waters. As order settled into habit and habit into expectation, the Sumerian world developed an acute sensitivity to boundaries. Everything that existed had a proper place, a proper time, and a proper measure. Crossing those invisible lines did not always provoke immediate disaster, but it invited imbalance, and imbalance never remained contained for long. This awareness shaped how humans understood ambition, success, and failure. Cities now stood as the most visible symbols of human achievement. Their walls rose from the plains like declarations of permanence in a landscape that rarely honored such claims. Inside those walls, life grew dense. Markets buzzed with exchange, workshops rang with metal and stone, temples towered above houses, marking the axis between earth and sky. Yet for all their apparent solidity, cities were understood as temporary arrangements, not eternal monuments. The gods were believed to dwell within cities only so long as balance held. A temple was not a guarantee of protection. It was a responsibility. Neglect rituals, distort justice, or exploit the weak, and divine favor could withdraw. When that happened, walls became meaningless. Flood, famine, or invasion followed. The lesson was clear. Structure without alignment was hollow. This belief explains why so much emphasis was placed on correct performance. Rituals were repeated precisely, words spoken in exact order, gestures performed without variation. Improvisation was dangerous. Innovation, when it occurred, was gradual and cautious. To change too much, too quickly, risked tearing the fabric that held gods and humans in cooperation. The Anunnaki, as figures of final authority, reinforced this caution. Their association with decrees of fate meant that some outcomes, once triggered, could not be reversed. Humans might negotiate with other gods through offerings and appeals, but when matters reached the Anunnaki, the process ended. Their judgments were not emotional reactions. They were confirmations that a line had been crossed. This perspective influenced how the Sumerians viewed knowledge itself. Wisdom was not the accumulation of facts, but the ability to recognize limits. Enki embodied this ideal. He did not seek to dominate reality. He sought to understand how it bent without breaking. His cleverness lay in knowing where pressure could be applied safely and where restraint was necessary. Stories about Enki often portray him as intervening just enough to prevent collapse, but never so much as to disrupt order. He saves humanity from extinction, but allows the flood to happen. He assigns roles to imperfect humans, but does not erase imperfection. His actions preserve continuity rather than restore an imagined ideal. This attitude extends to how the Sumerians understood progress. Development was real, but it was cyclical rather than linear. Cities rose, flourished, and fell. New dynasties replaced old ones. Technologies improved, then were lost, then rediscovered. None of this contradicted their worldview. It confirmed it. Stability was temporary by nature. The underworld remained the great equalizer. No matter how high a king rose or how wealthy a merchant became, all paths ended in the same dim realm. There, distinctions flattened, power faded. Memory alone maintained relevance. Offerings from the living sustained the dead, not as rewards, but as acknowledgments that existence did not end abruptly. It thinned. This thinning of existence after death influenced how life was lived. There was little emphasis on personal salvation or moral perfection. What mattered was participation in the system, fulfill obligations, maintain relationships, honor gods and ancestors. Excessive individuality was suspect. Community preserved balance. The Anunnaki's role as judges of the dead reflects this communal orientation. They did not weigh private thoughts. They assessed outcomes within the broader order. Did actions strengthen or weaken the system? Did they preserve continuity or accelerate decay? Judgment operated at the level of consequence rather than intention. This stands in stark contrast to later traditions that emphasize inner belief or moral purity. The Sumerian cosmos was external and observable. Meaning resided in action and effect. A person was known by what their life did to the world around them. Even the gods were subject to this logic. When divine actions disrupted balance, consequences followed. Inanna's descent results in death. Enlil's decision to flood the world nearly destabilizes the divine order itself. Enki must intervene, not because he is rebellious, but because unchecked authority threatens collapse. The divine assembly functions as a corrective mechanism. No single god rules absolutely. Decisions require consensus, or at least acknowledgement. This prevents unilateral action from unraveling creation. Authority is distributed, mirroring the administrative structures of human cities. Within this layered system, the Anunnaki occupy a fixed node. They do not deliberate publicly, they ratify. Their silence is part of their power. They represent the moment when debate ends and reality hardens. This concept of hardening appears repeatedly in Sumerian thought. Clay begins soft and workable. Once fired, it becomes permanent but brittle. Writing follows the same pattern. Spoken words vanish. Inscribed words endure, but cannot be changed without breaking the tablet. Fate operates similarly. While fluid, it can be influenced. Once set, it resists alteration. Human life unfolds within this window of softness. Youth offers flexibility. Age brings rigidity. Choices narrow. Possibilities close. This natural progression is accepted rather than resisted. To fight it is to exhaust oneself against an unyielding structure. By the time we reach Part 7, the Sumerian worldview has fully embraced this realism. It is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It is pragmatic. The universe is navigable, but only with attention. Power exists, but it must be handled carefully. Knowledge is valuable, but dangerous if misapplied. The Anunnaki serve as the final reminder of these truths. They do not threaten. They simply wait. Their presence ensures that actions accumulate weight, that patterns resolve into outcomes, and that no being, however powerful, escapes the structure established at the beginning when sky and earth were torn apart to make room for breath. Humanity continues within that space, building, remembering, and negotiating its fragile position. The waters still lie beneath. The sky still arches above. And between them, life persists, aware that balance is not given, but maintained moment by moment, choice by choice, until the final judgment closes the account. As centuries accumulated like layers of silt, the Sumerian sense of reality grew increasingly historical. The past was no longer an immeasurable expanse of mythic time alone. It became segmented, remembered through reigns, disasters, rebuildings, and names. Each generation inherited not only land and tools, but precedents. What had happened before mattered because it established what was likely to happen again. The world revealed itself as patterned, not random, and those patterns demanded respect. This growing historical awareness altered how the gods were perceived. They did not fade, but they became more specialized. Each deity's domain narrowed as human understanding sharpened. Storms were no longer merely divine moods. They followed recognizable seasons. Illnesses clustered in certain times of year. Floods followed patterns tied to mountain snowmelt. The gods remained responsible, but their behavior was now interpreted through accumulated observation. Enlil's storms were feared, but no longer mysterious. Inanna's wars were devastating, but predictable in their aftermath. Enki's interventions were subtle, but traceable through outcomes. This shift did not weaken belief. It refined it. The divine world became legible in fragments, never fully transparent, but no longer opaque. The Anunnaki's role sharpened further within this framework. They were no longer simply judges of the dead, but custodians of continuity across time. They ensured that endings remained endings. A destroyed city could be rebuilt, but a concluded fate could not be reopened. Their authority safeguarded the integrity of sequence itself. This concern with sequence explains the Sumerian obsession with lists. King lists, god lists, omen lists, lexical lists, all served to anchor reality within ordered progression. To list something was to stabilize it, to acknowledge its place within a broader system. Lists were not boring records. They were acts of preservation. The king list in particular functioned as a bridge between myth and history. It connected antediluvian rulers with mortal kings whose remains could be excavated. The impossibly long reigns at the beginning faded into plausible lifespans. The shift was not hidden. It was highlighted. The list itself marked the transition from a world of gods and hybrids to a world of humans alone. This transition did not imply decline in intelligence or worth. It implied responsibility. Without divine proximity, humans bore more of the burden for maintaining order. Rituals became more frequent, laws more detailed, records more meticulous. The less visible the gods became, the more carefully humans watched for their traces. Temples evolved accordingly. They became not only houses of worship, but centers of administration, storage, and learning. Grain was stored there. Contracts were recorded there. Astronomical observations were tracked there. The sacred and the practical merged seamlessly. There was no sharp division between religion and governance because both addressed the same problem: stability. The Anunnaki's association with fate reinforced this merger. Fate was not mystical abstraction. It was the accumulated weight of prior actions solidifying into consequence. In legal terms, a verdict ends debate. In cosmic terms, fate ends possibility. The same logic governed both realms. This understanding influenced how the Sumerians approached conflict. War was not glorified as heroic destiny. It was seen as disruptive necessity, sometimes unavoidable, always costly. Victory did not guarantee favor. Defeat did not imply abandonment. Outcomes were interpreted cautiously, measured against omens and aftermath rather than emotion. Inanna's presence in warfare myths underscores this caution. She grants success, but demands payment. Her favor is intoxicating but unstable. Cities that embraced her power too fully often paid later through destruction. Balance, once again, proved essential. The dead continued to shape the living world. Ancestor cults expanded. Offerings ensured that those who had crossed into the underworld did not fade into irrelevance. This was not sentimental remembrance. It was structural maintenance. The dead, though diminished, remained part of the system. Neglecting them weakened continuity. The Anunnaki presided over this continuity without compassion or cruelty. They represented necessity. Their lack of narrative drama is itself revealing. They are rarely protagonists because they are not negotiators. They are endpoints. Stories happen before and after them, not through them. Modern retellings that inflate their role misunderstand this restraint. The Sumerian imagination did not need spectacular overseers to explain its world. It needed coherence. The Anunnaki provided that by ensuring that once something concluded, it stayed concluded. This finality shaped attitudes toward innovation. New ideas were introduced carefully, often framed as rediscoveries rather than inventions. Claiming novelty risked hubris. claiming continuity preserved legitimacy. Even technological advances were often attributed to ancient divine gifts rather than recent human ingenuity. This pattern protected society from reckless change, but it also slowed adaptation. When environments shifted faster than tradition allowed, tension arose. Floods changed river courses. Trade routes shifted. New enemies appeared. The old frameworks strained to contain new realities. Yet even in these moments, the Sumerian response was not rejection of structure, but reinterpretation. Omens were reread, rituals adjusted, myths retold with emphasis shifted. Flexibility existed, but within boundaries. The Anunnaki remained untouched by these adjustments. Their authority did not change with fashion or necessity. This constancy anchored the system. Without fixed points, adaptation would dissolve into chaos. By Part 8, the Sumerian cosmos appears as a living archive. Past, present, and future interlock through ritual, record, and restraint. Humanity occupies a narrow but meaningful band within this structure, capable of shaping outcomes without controlling them. The waters beneath still threaten. The sky above still governs time. Between them, humans persist through memory and care. And at the limits of every endeavor, the Anunnaki wait, not as invaders, not as creators, but as the quiet confirmation that every story, no matter how long, eventually reaches its end. As the Sumerian world moved deeper into recorded time, attention shifted toward continuity under pressure. The land itself seemed restless. Rivers migrated, carving new channels while abandoning old ones. Cities that once thrived found themselves cut off from water or trade. Others rose quickly, where sediment made fields newly fertile. Human planning learned to contend not just with gods, but with change that arrived without warning. This instability sharpened the sense that existence was provisional. Structures endured only so long as conditions allowed. Temples required constant repair. Canals demanded relentless dredging. Without maintenance, the landscape reclaimed everything. Civilization was not a permanent achievement. It was a daily negotiation. The gods were understood as participants in this negotiation, but no longer guarantors of outcome. Offerings continued, but expectations were tempered. The Sumerians did not believe piety ensured safety. They believed it reduced risk. Favor made survival more likely, not certain. This distinction mattered. It prevented the collapse of belief when disaster struck despite devotion. The Anunnaki's role within this worldview became increasingly symbolic of irreversibility. They were invoked when something could no longer be mitigated. A fate sealed. A death confirmed. A city abandoned. Their presence marked the end of intervention. After them, there was only acceptance. This acceptance did not imply resignation. It encouraged preparation. People planned for loss as much as gain. Grain stores were expanded. Redundant canals were dug. Alliances were formed with the expectation they might fail. Prudence became a virtue equal to courage. The idea of destiny evolved accordingly. Destiny was not a fixed path mapped at birth. It was a narrowing corridor shaped by choices and conditions. Early in life, many outcomes were possible. Over time, options closed. The Anunnaki presided over the final narrowing, the moment when alternatives disappeared. This understanding influenced family structures. Lineage mattered because it preserved continuity beyond individual lives. Names were repeated across generations to keep identity alive. Inheritance laws ensured property remained within families, stabilizing social structure even as individuals died. Death rituals grew more elaborate, not because death was feared more, but because its consequences were better understood. Without proper rites, the dead risked becoming restless, not as malevolent spirits, but as unanchored remnants disrupting balance. Ritual restored placement. It told the dead where they belonged. The underworld's bureaucracy expanded in imagination. Gates, officials, rules, all mirrored the administrative systems above. This was not coincidence. The Sumerians believed structure was universal. Disorder was temporary. Even death followed protocol. The Anunnaki, as underworld authorities, reflected this principle. They were not monsters or executioners. They were administrators. Their power lay in consistency. They ensured that transitions were orderly, not chaotic. In doing so, they protected the system from unraveling. This bureaucratic vision extended upward as well. The divine assembly became increasingly prominent in myth. Decisions were debated. Authority was distributed. Even Enlil's power was checked by consensus. No god acted entirely alone without consequence. Human governance mirrored this arrangement. Councils advised kings. Elders mediated disputes. Absolute authority was viewed with suspicion. Concentrated power risked imbalance. Shared responsibility diffused risk. This caution shaped warfare. While conflict remained frequent, it was framed as last resort rather than destiny. Victory was celebrated, but also feared. Conquest expanded territory but strained resources. Captured cities brought wealth, but also obligation. Expansion carried hidden costs. The gods associated with war reflected this ambivalence. Inanna's favor could turn tides, but her withdrawal was devastating. Enlil's storms could crush enemies, but also destroy allies. Divine power was double-edged. The Anunnaki stood apart from this volatility. They did not shift allegiance. They did not escalate conflict. They represented closure rather than momentum. In this sense, they acted as a counterweight to ambition. This role made them central to oaths and treaties. Agreements sworn in their name carried finality. To break such an oath invited irreversible consequence. Their presence lent gravity to promises. Words spoken under their witness were not easily withdrawn. Writing amplified this gravity. A spoken oath could be denied. A written one endured. Tablets stored in temples became silent witnesses, preserving commitments beyond memory. Writing and the Anunnaki both enforced permanence in a world otherwise defined by flux. This permanence was not comforting. It was sobering. It reminded humans that some decisions could not be undone. Responsibility extended beyond immediate effect. Choices echoed forward. The Sumerians internalized this lesson deeply. Education emphasized repetition and accuracy. Apprentices copied texts endlessly to learn precision. Error was not merely failure, it was distortion of order. Correctness mattered because consequences accumulated. Myths reinforced this discipline. Stories punished arrogance, impatience, and excess. They rewarded caution, cleverness, and respect for limits. Heroes succeeded not by overpowering reality, but by understanding it. Enki remained the exemplar of this approach. His interventions were calculated, minimal, and strategic. He preserved humanity without challenging cosmic structure. He saved knowledge without erasing consequence. His wisdom lay in restraint. By contrast, gods who overreached paid prices. Enlil's flood nearly destabilized the divine order. Inanna's descent cost her life temporarily. These stories warned against absolutism. The Anunnaki's silence in such narratives is telling. They do not argue. They do not justify. They apply outcome. Their presence signals that debate has ended. By Part 9, the Sumerian worldview has fully embraced complexity without illusion. The universe is neither benevolent nor hostile. It is structured. Survival depends on understanding that structure and acting within it. Humanity occupies a narrow corridor between chaos and rigidity. Too much control suffocates life. Too little invites destruction. Balance is dynamic, never permanent. The waters beneath remain restless. The sky above remains distant. Between them, humans build, lose, rebuild, and remember. And at the far end of every effort, when possibility collapses into certainty, the Anunnaki stand as the final boundary, marking where action ends and consequence begins. With time, the Sumerian relationship to uncertainty matured into something quieter and more deliberate. Where earlier generations reacted to disruption with ritual urgency, later ones learned to expect instability as a constant feature of existence. This did not dull anxiety, it refined it. People no longer asked whether disaster would come, but when and in what form. Preparation replaced surprise. This mindset reshaped how knowledge was valued. Practical wisdom gained prominence over heroic idealism. Farmers observed soil and sky with patient attention. Builders learned which bricks failed first in floods. Scribes refined accounting systems to track surplus and loss with precision. Experience accumulated, not as progress toward mastery, but as resistance against collapse. The gods continued to matter, but belief expressed itself less through dramatic devotion and more through steady maintenance. Temples became centers of continuity rather than spectacle. Daily offerings mattered more than rare grand ceremonies. Faith was practiced through routine. Stability depended on repetition. The Anunnaki's place within this system became almost abstract. They were not frequently invoked in daily prayer. Their names surfaced at moments of closure, funerals, final judgments, binding oaths. They belonged to thresholds rather than processes. Their relevance increased as something ended, not while it unfolded. This distinction shaped how humans approached life stages. Birth was celebrated, but cautiously. Childhood was seen as a period of openness, vulnerable but flexible. Adulthood narrowed choices, bringing responsibility and consequence. Old age carried authority precisely because it marked proximity to finality. Death was not an interruption, but completion. The underworld was imagined less as a destination to fear and more as a condition to accept. It did not promise transformation or redemption. It promised continuity in reduced form. The dead existed without agency, sustained by memory and offerings. This perspective discouraged obsession with afterlife reward and redirected focus toward the living world. Because meaning was located in participation rather than salvation, ethical behavior emphasized reliability. A good person fulfilled obligations, honored agreements, and maintained balance within their community. Moral failure was measured by disruption rather than inner corruption. Ethics were relational, not introspective. The Anunnaki reinforced this externalized ethic. Their judgments concerned outcomes, not intentions. A harmful act carried weight regardless of motive. This discouraged rationalization. Responsibility could not be evaded through explanation. Legal practice mirrored this stance. Courts examined evidence, testimony, and consequence. Confession mattered less than proof. The goal was restoration of order, not purification of conscience. Punishment corrected imbalance rather than expressing outrage. This focus on order-shaped attitudes toward the natural world. Humans did not imagine themselves as separate from environment. They were embedded within it. Overuse of land invited retribution not because nature was moral, but because systems had limits. Exhaustion produced collapse. Irrigation practices reflected this understanding. Canals were extended carefully, with attention to flow and sediment. Overexpansion risked salinization, turning fertile fields barren. Knowledge of these dangers accumulated slowly through failure. Wisdom was often retrospective. The gods associated with water and fertility were treated with particular caution. Enki's domain reminded people that resources flowed from beneath, unseen and finite. Respecting that hidden reservoir mattered more than exploiting surface abundance. Overdrawing threatened long-term survival. The Anunnaki, presiding over the underworld, symbolized the ultimate consequence of ignoring limits. Death was the boundary no one crossed twice. Its certainty gave weight to restraint. This worldview did not eliminate ambition, but it tempered it. Great building projects were undertaken, but with awareness of risk. Cities were fortified, but evacuation plans existed. Trade expanded, but redundancy was built into routes. Hope was balanced by contingency. Mythology reinforced these lessons subtly. Stories emphasized survival over conquest, cleverness over strength, patience over speed. Heroes succeeded by reading situations accurately rather than forcing outcomes. Failure often followed arrogance. Inanna's volatile nature served as warning. Passion could empower, but also destroy. Excessive desire invited loss. Balance required moderation, even in devotion. The gods themselves embodied these tensions, modeling both potential and peril. The Anunnaki's restraint stood in contrast. Their lack of narrative drama made them reliable. They did not surprise. They concluded. This predictability provided a strange form of comfort. At least endings followed rules. As writing expanded further, historical records began to coexist with myth more visibly. Chronicles documented wars, floods, and reigns without cosmic framing. Yet even these records carried an implicit theology. Events were still interpreted within the larger structure of balance and consequence. When cities fell, explanations combined practical and divine reasoning. Poor defenses, resource depletion, and enemy strength were acknowledged alongside loss of favor and ignored omens. No single cause sufficed. Complexity was accepted. The Anunnaki's presence hovered over such explanations as silent confirmation that collapse had crossed a threshold. Once certain conditions were met, reversal was impossible. Recognition of this fact encouraged humility in rebuilding efforts. Reconstruction focused on restoring function rather than reclaiming former glory. New cities were often smaller, more defensible, more adaptable. Lessons were applied unevenly, but learning occurred. By Part 10, the Sumerian cosmos appears less dramatic but more resilient. It has absorbed catastrophe and adjusted expectations. Humanity no longer imagines returning to primordial closeness with the gods. That era is acknowledged as past and unrecoverable. What remains is responsibility within limitation. Life is lived attentively, with awareness that permanence is illusion, but continuity is achievable. The universe does not promise safety, but it offers structure. At the edge of that structure stand the Anunnaki. not as enemies or saviors, but as the final punctuation in every narrative. Their presence ensures that stories end cleanly, that cycles close, and that the world, fragile and bounded, continues not because it is perfect, but because it is remembered and maintained until memory itself finally gives way. As memory lengthened and experience accumulated, the Sumerian understanding of power grew increasingly nuanced. Power was no longer imagined as sheer force or divine favor alone. It was understood as something that flowed through systems, dependent on timing, restraint, and legitimacy. Those who grasped this survived longer than those who did not. Kings, once seen as near-divine figures, now operated within visible constraints. Their authority still originated from heaven, but it required constant reinforcement through justice, ritual, and practical competence. A king who failed to maintain canals or protect trade routes endangered not only his subjects, but his own mandate. Legitimacy was fragile, earned repeatedly rather than granted once. This fragility influenced royal behavior. Successful rulers presented themselves as caretakers rather than conquerors. In inscriptions, they emphasized restoration more than innovation, stability more than dominance. Victories were framed as necessary corrections, not personal triumphs. Hubris was carefully avoided in language, even when practiced in action. The gods mirrored this restrained model of power. Even Enlil, holder of immense authority, appears increasingly cautious in later narratives. His earlier decisiveness, which unleashed the flood, is remembered as a warning rather than an ideal. Absolute power without balance threatened the entire system, including the gods themselves. Enki's model of power gained prominence by contrast. His interventions were indirect, clever, and minimal. He did not overturn decrees. He navigated around them. His authority lay not in command, but in understanding structure deeply enough to bend it without breaking it. This approach resonated strongly with human governance in a constrained world. The Anunnaki represent power at its most inflexible. They do not persuade, negotiate, or adapt. Their authority is final because it is limited in scope. They act only when everything else has already happened. Their power cannot be abused because it cannot be applied early. It exists solely at the end. This made them paradoxically trustworthy. Humans and gods alike knew what to expect from them. There was no risk of sudden reversal or emotional reaction. Their judgments followed established patterns. This predictability reinforced the sense that the universe, while harsh, was not arbitrary. The relationship between power and knowledge became clearer as well. Those who understood patterns wielded influence disproportionate to their physical strength. Scribes, priests, and administrators shaped outcomes through interpretation, timing, and record-keeping. Information became a form of leverage. This shift elevated education as a critical social function. Apprenticeships were long and demanding. Copying texts was both training and preservation. Errors were corrected relentlessly. Accuracy mattered because it preserved continuity. A single miscopied sign could alter meaning and invite imbalance. Legal texts expanded in detail, addressing increasingly specific situations. This was not pedantry. It reflected recognition that unaddressed ambiguity bred conflict. Clarity stabilized society. The more predictable outcomes became, the less disruptive disputes were. The Anunnaki's association with final judgment reinforced this push toward clarity. If fate ultimately hardened, it was wise to shape events carefully before they reached that point. Prevention was always preferable to resolution. This awareness shaped interpersonal relationships as well. Contracts were formalized, witnesses were required. Trust was supported by structure rather than sentiment alone. This did not eliminate betrayal, but it limited its impact. Even family bonds were shaped by this logic. Marriage contracts specified obligations. Inheritance rules minimized conflict. Emotional ties existed, but they were reinforced by explicit expectations. Stability required more than affection. Religion adapted accordingly. Personal devotion remained important, but communal ritual took precedence. Individual spirituality mattered less than collective alignment. The gods favored communities that functioned smoothly, not individuals who acted passionately. Festivals reinforced shared identity and synchronized behavior. They reminded people of cosmic rhythms and historical precedent. Participation mattered more than interpretation. Unity strengthened resilience. The Anunnaki, though rarely celebrated, underscored these lessons implicitly. Their presence in myths signaled moments when personal desire gave way to systemic necessity. No individual could override outcome once it reached that stage. This understanding discouraged reckless rebellion. Challenges to authority were framed carefully, often justified as restorations rather than revolutions. Change needed legitimacy to succeed. Otherwise, it risked triggering irreversible consequences. The Sumerians were not passive. They adapted constantly. But adaptation occurred within a framework that valued continuity over rupture. Progress was incremental, cautious, and often retrospective. Mythology preserved this orientation. Stories warned against overreach. Characters who ignored limits suffered. Those who respected structure survived, even if imperfectly. Survival, not transcendence, was the highest achievement. The Anunnaki's impersonal authority reinforced this survival ethic. They were reminders that existence did not revolve around individual aspiration. It revolved around balance. By Part 11, the Sumerian worldview presents power as something that must circulate rather than accumulate. Concentrated power invited collapse. Distributed power endured. Knowledge, restraint, and memory sustained societies longer than force. The world remained unpredictable, but it was intelligible. Patterns could be learned, risks could be managed, outcomes could be influenced until a point beyond which acceptance replaced action. At that point, the Anunnaki appeared, not as enemies, not as saviors, but as confirmation that the process had concluded. Their presence marked the boundary where effort ceased and consequence prevailed. Within that boundary, humanity continued to live, govern, and remember. The waters beneath remained. The sky above persisted. And between them, human systems rose and fell, guided by a hard-earned understanding that power without balance destroys itself, while power shaped by limits can endure, even in a world that never stops testing it. As the Sumerian world aged further into its own awareness, the tension between permanence and decay became impossible to ignore. Cities that had once been centers of divine favor now lay buried beneath layers of silt and ruin. New cities rose nearby, often built with bricks recycled from the old. The past was not erased. It was reused, reshaped, and absorbed into the present. Civilization advanced not by escaping history, but by standing on it. This layering of existence shaped how the Sumerians understood continuity. Nothing truly disappeared. It transformed. A fallen city did not vanish from memory. It became a warning. A broken dynasty did not dissolve into irrelevance. It became a lesson. The world functioned like a palimpsest, with new inscriptions written over older ones that never fully faded. The gods were woven into this process. Divine favor was not permanent, but it was not random either. It responded to alignment. When a city collapsed, the explanation was rarely simple punishment. More often, it was framed as accumulated imbalance finally resolving itself. The gods did not abandon cities lightly. They withdrew when conditions no longer supported order. This withdrawal was terrifying precisely because it was quiet. There was no thunderous announcement, no cosmic spectacle. Favor faded through subtle signs, omens ignored, rituals neglected, justice compromised. By the time destruction arrived, it felt inevitable in retrospect. The Anunnaki presided over this inevitability without announcement or delay. Their role became increasingly symbolic of historical closure. When a city's fate was sealed, it passed beyond negotiation. Appeals ceased. Reconstruction, if it came, belonged to a new cycle entirely. The Anunnaki did not linger over ruins. They confirmed the end and moved on. This reinforced a sober approach to legacy. Kings became acutely aware that monuments could crumble and names could fade. Inscriptions increasingly emphasized humility and service rather than conquest. Rulers presented themselves as stewards of continuity, not masters of destiny. The concept of fame shifted accordingly. To be remembered was not to be immortalized in glory, but to be recorded accurately. Writing one's deeds truthfully mattered more than exaggerating them. Accuracy preserved meaning. Distortion invited imbalance. Scribes held enormous responsibility in this context. They were guardians of memory. A copied tablet extended the life of an idea. A lost tablet erased it. Knowledge survived only through constant transmission. Preservation was labor-intensive and never guaranteed. This fragility heightened respect for tradition. Innovations were framed as restorations of forgotten practices rather than departures from precedent. Even when something new emerged, it was justified by reference to ancient wisdom. Continuity legitimized change. The Anunnaki's association with fate reinforced this pattern. They represented the final authority of what had already occurred. One could reinterpret the past, but not undo it. Their presence anchored history, preventing it from being endlessly rewritten. This anchoring influenced how disasters were processed. When floods destroyed cities, survivors did not imagine reversing fate. They imagined learning from it. New settlements were placed differently. Canals were redesigned, defensive walls adjusted. Acceptance enabled adaptation. The gods associated with wisdom and craft played key roles in this learning process. Enka's influence persisted as a quiet guide toward resilience. His solutions were not dramatic. They were practical. Redirect water, reinforce foundations, share resources. The Anunnaki did not oppose this pragmatism. They operated beyond it. Their concern was not improvement, but closure. Once fate resolved, improvement belonged to the future, not the past. This distinction helped the Sumerians cope with loss. Mourning had limits. Grief was expressed through ritual, then released. Clinging too tightly to what had ended risked stagnation. Life demanded forward motion, even when memory remained. The underworld's stability contrasted sharply with the surface world's volatility. Below, nothing changed. Above, everything good. This inversion reinforced the idea that permanence belonged only to what no longer acted. Life, by definition, was unstable. The Anunnaki's governance of the underworld made them custodians of this permanence. Their realm did not evolve. It endured. This endurance lent gravity to endings. What passed into their domain was fixed. This understanding tempered ambition. Great projects were undertaken with awareness of eventual decay. Builders knew temples would need repair. Kings knew dynasties would end. The goal was not to defeat time, but to work within it. The Sumerians did not seek transcendence beyond the world. They sought continuity within it. Their myths do not promise escape. They promise explanation. They offer frameworks for enduring uncertainty, not eliminating it. By Part 12, the narrative settles into a philosophy of endurance. Civilization is fragile, but not meaningless. Its value lies in participation, not permanence. Each generation contributes briefly, then yields. The Anunnaki embody this yield. They stand at the threshold where contribution ends and record begins. They do not judge worth. They confirm conclusion. Within that confirmation, life continues elsewhere. New cities rise. New names are written. Old tablets are copied again. Memory persists through effort. The waters beneath still shift. The sky above still measures time. Between them, humans continue to build on ruins, guided by a worldview that does not deny loss, but integrates it. In this way, the Sumerian cosmos remains coherent. It does not promise salvation or final victory. It promises structure, consequence, and continuity through memory, and at the far edge of every cycle, the Anunnaki remain, silent and unmoved, ensuring that endings remain endings, so that beginnings may follow without confusion. By the time the Sumerian world reached the depth of reflection preserved in its later texts, a quiet realism had settled over its understanding of existence. The universe was no longer approached as a mystery to be solved or a drama to be won. It was approached as a condition to be managed. Meaning was not hidden behind the world. It was embedded within it, visible through patterns, repetition, and consequence. This realism shaped how people understood suffering. Misfortune was not always traced to moral failure or divine anger. Often it was recognized as the natural result of imbalance, delay, or limitation. Crops failed because water arrived incorrectly. Cities fell because defenses weakened. Illness spread because conditions allowed it. The gods were involved, but not always personally responsible. They governed structure, not individual comfort. This distinction mattered deeply. It allowed belief to survive disappointment. Faith did not collapse when prayers went unanswered, because prayers were never guarantees. They were engagements with probability. Appeasement reduced risk. It did not eliminate it. This sober expectation preserved trust in the divine order even when outcomes were harsh. The Anunnaki's role fit perfectly within this realism. They were never appealed to for mercy or blessing. They were acknowledged when outcomes could no longer be altered. Their authority lay precisely in the absence of negotiation. They represented the moment when interpretation ended and reality hardened. This understanding encouraged emotional restraint. Excessive hope was as dangerous as despair. Both distorted perception. The ideal response to uncertainty was attentiveness rather than passion. To observe carefully, act deliberately, and accept outcome without illusion became the hallmark of wisdom. This ethic influenced artistic expression. Sumerian hymns and laments are powerful, but controlled. They express grief without indulging it, praise without excess. Emotion is present, but contained within form. Even sorrow follows structure. Laments over destroyed cities exemplify this balance. They do not rage against fate. They recount events with precision, naming causes, acknowledging loss, and reaffirming continuity. The city has fallen, but the world has not ended. Memory ensures that collapse does not erase meaning. The gods appear in these laments as witnesses rather than perpetrators. They observe, withdraw, and allow consequence to unfold. Their silence is not cruelty. It is consistency. Intervention after a certain point would violate order. The Anunnaki hover over these moments as guarantors of closure. Once destruction occurs, it is finalized. Mourning must proceed, but reversal is impossible. Acceptance becomes necessary for survival. This acceptance does not diminish responsibility. On the contrary, it heightens it. Knowing that some outcomes cannot be undone encourages careful action earlier. Prevention becomes the highest form of wisdom. This principle extends to personal life. Individuals are encouraged to maintain moderation, fulfill obligations, and avoid extremes. Excessive ambition risks imbalance. Excessive caution risks stagnation. Balance remains the guiding ideal. The underworld's unchanging nature reinforces this lesson. Below, nothing improves, nothing worsens. Above, everything fluctuates. Life's value lies in movement, not in permanence. Death freezes motion. Therefore, life must be used, not preserved. The Anunnaki's governance of the underworld makes them symbols of stillness. They do not act because their domain does not change. Their authority rests on immobility. In contrast, the living world depends on adaptability. This contrast deepens the Sumerian appreciation for timing. Knowing when to act mattered more than acting forcefully. Delayed action could be fatal. Premature action could be destructive. Wisdom lay in recognizing the moment when influence remained possible. Divination served this need, but it was never infallible. Omens indicated pressure points, not certainty. They guided but did not replace judgment. Responsibility remained human. The gods respected this responsibility. They did not absolve humans of consequence. Divine favor did not erase error. It sometimes softened impact but never nullified it. This reinforced accountability. The Anunnaki's finality sharpened this accountability. Knowing that fate eventually closed ensured that choices carried weight. There was no endless correction. At some point, results stood. This worldview produced neither fatalism nor optimism. It produced steadiness. Life was navigable, but not conquerable. The world offered no ultimate victory, but it allowed continuity through care. Writing preserved this care across generations. Each tablet was an act of defiance against forgetting. Each copied text extended the reach of memory. The scribes understood that knowledge survived only through effort. Neglect erased even the most important truths. The Anunnaki's presence at the end of narratives reinforced the value of record. Once fate concluded, only memory remained. Writing ensured that memory did not vanish with those who experienced it. By Part 13, the Sumerian worldview stands fully articulated. It does not promise transcendence, revelation, or escape. It offers coherence. The universe operates according to patterns that can be learned, respected, and navigated. Humans exist within those patterns as temporary participants. Their role is not to dominate, but to maintain. Their success is measured not by permanence, but by continuity. The waters beneath still threaten erasure. The sky above still governs time. Between them, life unfolds briefly, shaped by forces that do not bend to desire. At the far edge of that unfolding stand the Anunnaki, not watching, not judging in the emotional sense, but confirming that the process has reached its conclusion. Their silence does not diminish meaning. It preserves it. Because endings are final, beginnings remain possible. Because fate closes, life opens elsewhere. And within that rhythm, the Sumerian cosmos remains intact, sustained not by miracles or domination, but by understanding, restraint, and the hard-earned acceptance that to exist is not to triumph, but to endure with awareness until the final boundary is reached. In the long aftermath of adaptation and restraint, the Sumerian world developed a refined sense of proportion. Great forces existed, but they were not infinite. Human action mattered, but it was not absolute. Between these truths lay a careful calibration that guided daily life. The universe, as understood now, was neither a stage for heroics nor a prison of inevitability. It was a field of pressures that rewarded attention and punished neglect. This calibration shaped how communities responded to stress. When harvests failed, the response was not immediate blame or panic. Elders reviewed omens, records, and precedent. Was the failure isolated or recurring? Was water mismanaged or timing misread? The gods were consulted, but so were ledgers and memories. Causes were sought across layers, not reduced to a single explanation. The presence of layered causation allowed belief to coexist with practicality. A drought could be divine displeasure and hydrological anomaly at the same time. Addressing one without the other was insufficient. Ritual and engineering worked together. Offerings were made while canals were repaired. Meaning and mechanics were never separated. The Anunnaki's role in this layered understanding was precise. They were not involved in diagnosis. They were involved in outcome. When a failure repeated enough times to signal closure, when a city could no longer sustain itself, when a dynasty could no longer command allegiance, the Anunnaki marked the end. Their authority did not explain why something failed. It confirmed that it was finished. This distinction mattered. It preserved the usefulness of analysis without granting it unlimited power. Humans could learn, adapt, and correct, up to a point. Beyond that point, acceptance replaced intervention. The wisdom lay in recognizing where that point was. Such recognition influenced migration patterns. Abandoned cities were not always rebuilt. Sometimes relocation was chosen over restoration. This was not defeat. It was alignment. To persist in a place no longer viable was to fight the structure of reality itself. Moving on preserved continuity. Myths encoded this lesson repeatedly. Cities favored by the gods thrived until they did not. Their decline was not sudden betrayal. It was gradual misalignment. When collapse came, it was decisive. Lamentation followed, then rebuilding elsewhere. The Anunnaki's quiet authority reinforced this decisiveness. They ensured that endings did not linger ambiguously. Ambiguity invited false hope. Finality cleared space for renewal. This clarity influenced personal conduct as well. Individuals learned to release what could not be sustained. Relationships ended. Roles changed. Aging brought shifts in responsibility. Clinging beyond usefulness risked imbalance. The underworld symbolized this release. Those who entered it no longer acted. They existed as memory, sustained by offerings, but removed from influence. This removal was not punishment. It was order. The living needed room to act. The gods respected this order. They did not routinely retrieve the dead. Exceptions existed, but they were costly and disruptive. Resurrection was not a norm, it was a warning. Interfering with finality had consequences. The Anunnaki stood as guardians of this boundary. Their judgments prevented leakage between states. Life remained life. Death remained death. Each had its domain. This firm boundary lent intensity to living. Knowing that time was limited sharpened attention. Achievements were measured against duration, not eternity. A good life was one that maintained balance while it lasted. Art and literature reflected this intensity. Scenes focused on moments of decision, transition, and loss. Characters were defined by responses to constraint rather than by boundless potential. Drama emerged from limitation. Even the gods were portrayed within this frame. They struggled, erred, and adapted. Their power did not exempt them from structure. This portrayal made the cosmos intelligible rather than arbitrary. If even gods faced consequence, humans could accept theirs. The Anunnaki's immunity to narrative struggle made them distinct. They did not err because they did not choose. They did not adapt because their function was fixed. They represented the stable axis around which change revolved. This axis allowed society to evolve without losing coherence. Innovations were absorbed into existing frameworks. New practices were evaluated against established patterns. Sudden rupture was rare and dangerous. When rupture did occur, through invasion, catastrophe, or internal collapse, it was framed as a crossing of thresholds rather than a mystery. The language of fate, judgment, and closure provided structure for grief and rebuilding. The Sumerian worldview thus avoided both denial and despair. It acknowledged loss without surrendering to it. It planned without assuming control. It remembered without being trapped by memory. By Part 14, the narrative emphasizes this equilibrium as the core achievement of the Sumerian imagination. Not the creation of cities, not the invention of writing, but the development of a worldview capable of enduring uncertainty without illusion. The waters beneath still threatened, the sky above still measured time. Between them, humans continued to adjust, guided by a sense that meaning was not granted by victory or permanence, but by appropriate response to circumstance. At the far boundary of that response stood the Anunnaki. They did not reward effort or punish failure. They confirmed transitions. Their presence allowed the living to stop struggling when struggle no longer served. Because endings were firm, beginnings could proceed without confusion. Because fate closed doors, attention shifted to those still open. Because judgment existed, action carried weight. In this way, the Sumerian cosmos remained balanced, not static, not serene, but functional. It did not promise escape from limitation. It offered a way to live intelligently within it. And as long as memory endured, etched into clay, spoken in ritual, carried in habit, the world continued to hold together, not despite its boundaries, but because of them, with the Anunnaki standing silently at the edges, ensuring that structure, once established, did not dissolve into endless uncertainty. As the long arc of Sumerian thought approached its furthest visible horizon, reflection turned inward, not toward the self as an isolated interior, but toward humanity's position within the vast mechanism that had been patiently described for generations. The universe was no longer imagined as something unfolding. It had unfolded already. What remained was participation within what had been set. This realization did not produce stagnation. It produced focus. Energy was no longer spent asking what the world was becoming, but how one should act within what it was. The question shifted from origin to conduct, from creation to maintenance. Life was understood as stewardship rather than conquest. Human identity, in this framework, was fundamentally relational. A person existed through obligations, to family, to city, to gods, to the dead. Individual ambition mattered only insofar as it strengthened these connections. To act purely for oneself was to weaken the web that sustained existence. This is why isolation appears so rarely as a virtue in Sumerian thought. Withdrawal from community was dangerous. Separation threatened balance. Even hermits and specialists remained bound to ritual and exchange. Total independence was neither admired nor feasible. The Anunnaki's role reinforced this relational identity. They did not judge individuals in isolation. They assessed placement within the whole. A person's fate was inseparable from their context. Actions rippled outward, accumulating consequence until closure was reached. This understanding shaped how mistakes were addressed. Error was expected. Perfection was not. What mattered was response. Correction, restitution, and adjustment restored balance. Denial and stubbornness magnified damage. Responsibility did not end at intention. It extended through effect. The gods modeled this principle imperfectly. They erred, reacted, and learned. Their stories demonstrated that power did not confer immunity from consequence. Even divine miscalculations produced lasting effects. This reinforced the lesson that structure governed all beings. The Anunnaki's exemption from narrative struggle marked them as something different. They did not learn because learning implied change. Their function was to hold the line where change ceased. They were not wiser than other gods. They were fixed. This fixity gave them a unique moral gravity. They did not forgive or condemn emotionally. They concluded. Their presence ensured that the system did not spiral endlessly through revision. Without finality, meaning would dissolve into perpetual uncertainty. This insight carried into Sumerian reflections on aging. Youth represented possibility. Maturity represented responsibility. Old age represented proximity to closure. Elders were respected not because they were closer to the gods, but because they were closer to completion. Their perspective carried weight because it had endured. Death rituals emphasized transition rather than loss. The dead were not gone. They were relocated. Their influence diminished, but their place remained. Offerings acknowledged continued connection without denying separation. The Anunnaki's governance of this transition ensured clarity. Death did not blur into life. Memory did not replace presence. Each state had boundaries. Respecting those boundaries preserved order. This clarity shaped emotional expression. Grief was expressed openly, then contained. Excessive mourning threatened stagnation. Ritual marked appropriate duration for sorrow, after which life resumed. This was not suppression. It was regulation. The same applied to joy. Celebration occurred, but within limits. Excess invited imbalance. Festivals followed calendars. Feasting followed harvests. Timing mattered as much as intensity. The Sumerian worldview thus avoided extremes. It neither glorified suffering nor indulged pleasure. It acknowledged both as conditions to be managed. Balance remained the guiding principle. Writing continued to play a crucial role in sustaining this balance. Texts were copied not to preserve originality, but accuracy. Variation was minimized. Consistency maintained coherence. The past was not reinvented. It was transmitted. This transmission created a sense of collective identity that extended beyond individual lifetimes. People knew they were part of something older than themselves, and destined to continue after them. This awareness softened fear of death without eliminating it. The Anunnaki's presence at the far end of life reinforced this continuity. They ensured that endings were clean, allowing the system to move forward without unresolved residue. Closure was not cruelty. It was necessity. In this light, the cosmos appears less as a narrative and more as an architecture. It does not tell a story of progress or decline. It provides a framework within which stories occur. The value of those stories lies not in their outcome, but in how they are lived. Humanity's role within this architecture is modest but meaningful. Humans do not shape the foundations. They furnish the interior. They maintain what has been built. Their success is measured by stability, not transcendence. The gods, likewise, do not escape the structure. They operate within assigned domains. Their conflicts and alliances adjust balance, but do not redefine reality. Only the primordial acts, the separation of sky and earth, the establishment of fate, set boundaries. The Anunnaki stand closest to those boundaries. They are reminders of the original severing that made existence possible. Without separation, nothing could live. Without finality, nothing could matter. By Part 15, the Sumerian worldview stands complete, not as a closed doctrine, but as a functioning system. It explains enough to guide action without claiming total understanding. It accepts mystery without surrendering to it. Life proceeds under this system not with certainty, but with orientation. People know where they stand, what is expected, and where limits lie. This knowledge does not guarantee safety. It guarantees intelligibility. The waters beneath remain patient. The sky above remains distant. Between them, human lives unfold briefly, shaped by choice, circumstance, and constraint. And when those lives reach their final threshold, the Anunnaki remain where they have always been, silent, unmoving, ensuring that the passage from action to memory occurs without confusion, so that the world, fragile and ordered, can continue without unraveling. At the far edge of the Sumerian imagination, where myth no longer expanded and history no longer explained, what remained was not revelation, but orientation. The universe did not resolve into a final answer. It settled into a posture. Everything that could be said had been said before, pressed into clay, recited in ritual, and lived through repetition. What endured was not certainty, but coherence. Humanity, in this final perspective, was never the center of existence, yet it was never insignificant. People occupied a precise band of reality, suspended between forces that neither noticed them individually nor excluded them entirely. The gods did not orbit human desire. Humans moved within divine structure, meaning emerged from alignment, not attention. The earliest memories of water without boundary and sky pressed against earth had long since receded into abstraction, but their consequences persisted. Separation made life possible. Distance made responsibility unavoidable. What began as cosmic rupture matured into existential condition. To live was to operate within limits created before memory began. The Anunnaki, present from the middle onward, remained unchanged to the end. They did not evolve because evolution belonged to what could still act. Their stillness was their function. They represented the final state toward which all motion tended. In a world defined by flux, they were fixed. This fixity gave shape to everything else. Because endings existed, beginnings carried weight. Because actions concluded, choices mattered. Without finality, effort would dissolve into endless revision. The Anunnaki ensured that life moved forward by preventing it from looping endlessly back upon itself. In this sense, they were not judges in a moral framework, but anchors in a structural one. They did not determine good or evil. They confirmed outcome. They ensured that once a process completed, it remained complete. This understanding freed the Sumerian worldview from obsession with reward or punishment. Life was not a test. It was a task. Success meant maintaining balance for as long as one's role allowed. Failure meant contributing to imbalance. Both were temporary conditions within a larger continuity. The underworld, governed by the Anunnaki, embodied this continuity without agency. Those who entered it no longer shaped the world, but they did not vanish. They persisted as memory and presence without power. This persistence reinforced the idea that existence did not end abruptly. It narrowed. Memory thus became the final human contribution. To remember accurately was to honor reality. To distort memory was to invite confusion. Writing, ritual, and repetition preserved clarity where presence could not. The Sumerians did not imagine a future radically different from their present. They imagined recurrence. Cities would rise and fall. Floods would return. Kings would rule and be forgotten. What mattered was not avoiding this cycle, but navigating it intelligently. Their myths did not promise salvation beyond the world. They offered instruction within it. They did not elevate humanity above nature. They embedded humanity within it. The gods, too, were embedded. They were not transcendent absolutes. They were expressions of structure. Their conflicts, alliances, and failures mirrored human ones because both operated under the same constraints. Only the Anunnaki stood apart from this mirroring. They did not resemble humans because they did not participate in change. They marked its end. Their silence was not absence, it was function. By the final layer of this worldview, the cosmos no longer needed explanation. It needed maintenance. Order survived not through miracles, but through attention. Balance endured not through dominance, but through restraint. Human life, brief and vulnerable, gained dignity from participation rather than outcome. A person mattered not because they transcended death, but because they acted responsibly before it. This ethic did not require belief in progress. It required commitment to continuity. Each generation inherited a fragile system and passed it on, altered but intact. Failure was possible, collapse was real, yet rebuilding followed because memory survived. The Anunnaki ensured that collapse did not blur into denial. Endings were acknowledged. Loss was named. Only then could renewal occur without illusion. In this final perspective, the Sumerian universe stands neither optimistic nor bleak. It is lucid. It offers no promise of rescue, but no condemnation either. It provides a structure within which meaning can exist without fantasy. The waters beneath still wait. The sky above still governs cycles. Between them, life continues briefly, attentively, shaped by forces that do not bend to desire. When that life ends, it does not disappear into chaos. It crosses a boundary that has existed since the first separation made breath possible. At that boundary stand the Anunnaki, unchanged, unmoved, ensuring that the transition from action to memory occurs cleanly, without confusion. And so the story does not conclude with triumph or revelation, it concludes with orientation. The world remains what it has always been, a space carved out of chaos, maintained through balance, and held together by the acceptance that to exist is not to escape limits, but to live intelligently within them until the final boundary is reached and the account, at last, is closed.